Welcome to Story of the Phantom of the Northern Line. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey. But before we start, let me know, from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1, The Body Beneath Mornington Crescent. The fog arrived before the corpse, though both, as it turned out, had been expected by someone. It was the 20th of November, 1894, and London lay smothered beneath a yellow pall so dense that the gas lamps along Baker Street burned like distant drowning suns. I had risen early that morning, or rather, I had never properly gone to bed, having spent the small hours attending to a retired colonel from Camberwell, whose gout had flared with the season's first real cold. So I returned to 221B shortly before 5 o'clock and found Sherlock Holmes exactly where I had left him 7 hours earlier, seated cross-legged on the floor before the fireplace, surrounded by railway timetables, geological surveys, and empty coffee cups. "Ah, Watson," he said, without looking up, "you smell of camphor, cab horse, and mild professional despair. The Colonel's gout, I take it, proved resistant to persuasion." I did not dignify this with a reply. At 20 minutes past the hour, Mrs. Hudson appeared with the unmistakable expression of a woman who has been roused from sleep by someone she would very much like to strike. "Inspector Lestrade," she announced, with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Lestrade entered like a man walking against a strong wind. His collar was damp, his moustache limp, and the particular smell of London's underground clung to him, that mixture of soot, damp stone, and something faintly metallic. "Holmes," he said, "I need you at Mornington Crescent. There's a body in a tunnel that shouldn't exist, killed by a method I can't explain, and the night crew are refusing to go back underground because they believe they've seen a ghost." Holmes's grey eyes, dull with the tedium of whatever exercise had occupied him through the night, sharpened instantly. "A ghost? How refreshing! Tell me everything, Lestrade, and do try to include the details your superiors have told you to suppress." In the cab, Lestrade explained. The dead man was Edward Mallory, aged 47, a financial consultant who maintained offices in the city and handled accounts of a sensitive nature for the War Office, a detail Lestrade mentioned with the studied casualness of a man who has been told not to mention it at all. Mallory had been found at 3:30 that morning by a maintenance crew in a narrow service passage branching off the main Northern Line tunnel near Mornington Crescent Station. According to every official record, that passage had been bricked up and sealed since 1879. And yet the bricks had been removed, Holmes said. It was not a question. Removed and replaced, loosely. You'd never notice unless you were looking. Someone's been using that passage. There are footprints in the dust, one set going in, none coming out the same way. Which means there is another exit. Lestrade nodded. We haven't found it. The passage goes deeper than we've been willing to follow." "And the ghost?" Holmes asked. "Thomas Keegan, night watchman, 23 years on the job, steady as a stone wall. He was doing his rounds near the platform at approximately 11:15 when he saw a figure at the far end of the tunnel. Tall man, long dark overcoat, old-fashioned like something from his grandfather's time, carrying an oil lantern, the old railway kind they haven't used since the 70s. Keegan shouted. The figure walked straight toward the tunnel wall and vanished. A moment later, a train came through, and when it passed, the platform was empty. "Theatrical," Holmes murmured. He was smiling, that thin, sharp-edged smile that appeared only when the world had presented him with something worth his attention. We descended into Mornington Crescent through a service entrance that smelled of rust and standing water. The station was closed, and the silence was profound, the deep mineral silence of a place built for noise and suddenly emptied of it. The main tunnel stretched before us, curving into darkness. 2 constables stood at the entrance to the service passage, both young, both visibly uncomfortable. Holmes ducked into the passage without a word. It was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, with a low ceiling of rough Victorian brickwork blackened with age. The floor was thick with undisturbed dust except for a single track of footprints. The air changed immediately, thicker, staler, carrying the taste of abandonment. 15 yards in, we found Edward Mallory. He lay on his back, eyes open, arms at his sides. No blood. His clothing, a well-tailored suit and overcoat of good wool, was undisturbed. He looked as though he had simply lain down and decided not to rise, but the marks on his throat told a different story. Holmes knelt and produced his magnifying glass. The ligature marks were thin, much thinner than one would expect from rope or hands. They formed a single clean line encircling the throat, cutting into skin with a uniformity that spoke of enormous, evenly applied pressure. No finger bruises, no scratching, no sign that Mallory had clawed at whatever was killing him. "Taken from behind," Holmes said quietly. "The ligature is wire, thin, smooth, possibly braided. Once positioned, it allows no resistance. The pressure was applied in a single continuous motion. No hesitation mark. Whoever did this has done it before, and been trained to do so with the efficiency of a man for whom killing is procedure, not passion." I examined the marks and was forced to agree. In my years of medical practice and my service in Afghanistan, I had seen the aftermath of strangulation in several forms. This bore no resemblance to the desperate, ragged work of a crime of passion. "A garrote," I said. "A military garrote," Holmes corrected. "The wire gauge, the uniformity, the absence of defensive injury. This weapon is not available in shops. It is issued, Watson, to men whose profession requires them to end lives without making a sound." He spent 20 minutes moving through the passage in both directions. He scraped something from the brickwork with a penknife and held it to his nose. He crouched over the footprints. "Are you making rapid sketches?" Then he returned to us. 3 observations. First, the footprints. Heavy-soled boots, military pattern, with a distinctive asymmetric wear on the left heel. The gait is confident and unhesitating. Our killer walked this passage as a man walks a road he has travelled 100 times, and no prints going out this way, which confirms a second exit deeper in the tunnel system. "Second," I prompted. He held up the penknife. A thin film of yellowish residue glistened on the blade. "Machine oil, but not railway oil. I have made a particular study of industrial lubricants, and this compound is not used in underground maintenance. I shall analyse it at Baker Street." He did not elaborate. "Third." Holmes reached into the dead man's breast pocket and withdrew a folded letter. Half written, the ink still dark. He read aloud. "Dear Sir, I write to you in the strictest confidence regarding a matter of the most serious nature. In the course of my professional duties, I have discovered an irregularity concerning..." And there it stops. The envelope is addressed to the War Office, Whitehall. Lestrade took the letter. "You think this is connected to his War Office work?" "I think a man who handles sensitive military accounts discovered something that someone is willing to kill to keep secret. I think the method, a military garrote, wielded with professional expertise, is not a coincidence. And I think our theatrical ghost is not a phantom at all, but a very real and very dangerous man who understands that the best way to ensure no one investigates what happens in these tunnels is to make certain that everyone is too frightened to enter them." We emerged into the grey morning. The fog had thickened, and the world above ground felt scarcely more real than the one below. A small crowd had gathered near the station entrance. Among them, I noticed a tall, clean-shaven man in a military-cut overcoat who stood apart from the others, watching the station entrance with calm, detached interest. He carried himself with the straight-backed ease of a career officer. When our eyes met, He inclined his head with a courteous half-smile, before turning and disappearing into the fog. I thought nothing of it at the time. I would think a great deal of it later. At the station entrance, a young sergeant informed Lestrade that Edward Mallory's next of kin had been located. A brother, Edgar Mallory, residing in Mornington Crescent itself, barely 300 yards from the murder. Edgar arrived within the hour. He was heavier than his brother, florid, with unsteady hands that spoke of a long familiarity with the bottle. His shock at Edward's death appeared genuine, but when Lestrade asked when he had last seen his brother, a different expression crossed his features, not grief, but something closer to guilt. 2 days ago, Edgar said. We argued about money, family matters. I said things I should not have said. His housekeeper heard the whole business, but I swear, I would never. Where were you last night between 11 and midnight? Lestrade asked. At home, alone. I'd been drinking. Yeah, there is no one who can confirm it. I saw Lestrade's eyes narrow. I saw the machinery of official suspicion begin to turn toward this man. Motive, proximity, no alibi, and trembling hands that could be read as guilt as easily as grief. Holmes, standing by the window, said nothing. But I caught the faintest shake of his head, not for Lestrade, not for Edgar, but for himself. The gesture of a man watching an obvious answer present itself and finding it deeply insufficient. In the cab back to Baker Street, Holmes was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low enough that the driver could not hear. This was not done in anger, Watson. This was done with the precision of a man who has killed before and been trained to do so. The question is not who hated Edward Mallory enough to murder him. The question is who needed him silent, and what it was that Mallory was about to say. He turned to the window. The fog pressed against the glass like something alive. London is a city built upon its own shadows, and somewhere beneath our feet someone is using those shadows to move unseen. We have found one body, Watson. I do not think it will be the last. Chapter 2. Into the Darkness. The sample of machine oil sat in a shallow glass dish on Holmes's chemical table, catching the thin November light that managed to press through the fog and into our sitting room. Holmes had been bent over it for the better part of 2 hours, subjecting it to a series of reagents, heating it over a spirit lamp, and examining the residue through his microscope with the silent intensity of a man conducting a conversation with the substance itself. And I had learned long ago not to interrupt these rituals. I occupied myself with the morning papers, which were already full of the Mornington Crescent murder, though the details, as reported, bore only a passing resemblance to what we had actually observed. The Northern Line Phantom, I read aloud. That is what they are calling him. The Daily Telegraph has devoted half a page to the history of ghost sightings on the Underground. The Illustrated London News has commissioned an artist's impression of the spectre. It is, I must say, rather atmospheric. It is rather useful, Holmes replied without looking up. To the killer. Every column inch devoted to ghosts is a column inch not devoted to the investigation of a very human crime. Our man could not have purchased better misdirection if he had taken out an advertisement. He straightened at last, wiping his hands on a cloth already black with chemical residue. His expression was one I knew well, the controlled satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. The oil, Watson. It is not railway lubricant. It is not machine shop oil. It is not used in any civilian application I can identify. It is, however, an exact match for the compound employed in the maintenance of the Webley-Fosbury automatic revolver when fitted with a suppressor attachment, a weapon that exists, to my knowledge, only in the armories of military intelligence. It is issued to officers engaged in covert operations and is emphatically not available to the general public. A military weapon, I said. That aligns with the garrote. It does more than align, Watson. It converges. We now have two pieces of physical evidence, the ligature marks and the lubricant, that point unmistakably toward a killer with military training and access to restricted weaponry. This is not a crime of opportunity committed by a bitter brother or a wronged business partner. This is the work of a professional. He crossed to the mantelpiece and filled his pipe, his eyes distant. But a professional in service of what? That is the question. A military man does not kill a financial consultant in an abandoned tunnel for personal reasons. He kills because the consultant discovered something, and the tunnel itself is the answer to what that something is. Shortly before noon, Holmes dispatched a series of telegrams to the Metropolitan Railway offices, to the London County Council archives, and to a name I did not recognise, but which Holmes described only as a man who knows more about the earth beneath London than the earth knows about itself. By 2 o'clock, he had secured permission for a formal inspection of the Northern Line tunnel system, accompanied by a reluctant Lestrade and a railway engineer named Hobson, who looked as though he would rather have been anywhere else in the British Empire. We descended once more into Mornington Crescent. The station had reopened to limited traffic, but the service passage where Mallory's body had been found remained sealed behind a heavy iron gate, and a constable whose youth and pallor suggested he had drawn the short straw. Holmes produced the authorization papers. The gate was unlocked, and we entered the passage for the second time in 24 hours. The body was gone, but its outline remained, a vaguely human disturbance in the thick dust, surrounded by the marks of police boots and the drag lines of the stretcher that had carried Mallory to the surface. Holmes passed these by without interest. His attention was fixed on the far end of the passage, where the footprints of the killer led deeper into the earth. "Mr. Hobson," Holmes said, "what lies beyond this point?" Hobson consulted a set of plans he had brought rolled under his arm, current survey maps of the Northern Line infrastructure. He traced the passage with a tobacco-stained finger and frowned. Nothing, according to these. This corridor terminates in a brick wall approximately 60 feet ahead. It was part of the original 1867 construction, a ventilation shaft that was sealed when the line was modernised in 79. There should be nothing passable beyond where we stand. "And yet someone has been passing," Holmes said. "Shall we see where?" We followed the footprints. They led us along the narrow passage, past walls that wept with condensation, and a ceiling so low that Lestrade, the tallest among us, was forced to walk with his head bowed. The air grew thicker with each step, heavier, older, carrying the weight of decades without circulation. Our lamps threw long shadows that moved against the brickwork like something alive. At 58 feet we reached the wall Hobson's plans predicted. It stretched across the full width of the passage, floor to ceiling, built of the same dark Victorian brick as the surrounding tunnel. To any casual observer, it was a dead end. But Holmes was not a casual observer. He ran his fingers along the mortar joints at chest height, pressing and probing with the methodical patience of a safe cracker. After perhaps 2 minutes, he found what he was looking for. A section of brickwork, roughly 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, where the mortar was newer than its surroundings. Not obviously so, it had been stained and dusted to match the surrounding wall, but beneath the cosmetic aging, the compound was softer, more recently mixed. "Here," Holmes said. He pressed his palm flat against the section and pushed. The bricks shifted inward with a grinding whisper, revealing a gap of absolute darkness beyond. Cold air rushed out to meet us, not the stale air of a sealed passage, but a moving current that carried with it the distant rumble of trains and the unmistakable scent of a larger space. Hobson stared. "That is not on any plan I have ever seen." "No," Holmes agreed. "I rather suspect it would not be." We passed through the gap one at a time. Beyond the false wall, the passage widened into a proper corridor, taller, broader, and far older than the service tunnel we had left behind. The brickwork here was of a different era, the craftsmanship more ornate, with arched ceilings and iron brackets that had once held gas lamps. The dust was thick but not uniform. A clear path had been worn through the centre, evidence of repeated foot traffic over a sustained period. Holmes moved along this path, with his lamp held low, examining the floor with the focus of a man reading a text written in a language only he could speak. He stopped twice, once to study a scuff mark on the wall at shoulder height, and once to kneel beside a faint impression in the dust that made him draw a sharp breath through his teeth. "The boot prints," he said, beckoning me forward. "The same military tread, the same asymmetric wear on the left heel. And here, do you see, the stride length changes." He was walking quickly at this point, not running but moving with purpose, a man who knows his route and keeps to a schedule. He made plaster casts of the clearest prints, working quickly and without conversation, then continued deeper into the corridor. The tunnel branched twice, once to the left, descending steeply toward what Hobson believed was the original deep-level construction from the 1860s, and once to the right, climbing gradually toward what our sense of direction suggested was the Camden town area. Holmes chose the right-hand branch. 40 yards along this corridor he stopped again. His lamp illuminated a section of wall where a single brick had been pulled forward from its row, creating a narrow shelf behind it. Holmes reached in and withdrew his hand, holding a brass cylinder, approximately 8 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, with threaded caps at both ends. He unscrewed one cap and held the open cylinder beneath his nose. Then he passed it to me. "Fresh ink," I said, "and paper. This has held documents very recently." "It is a courier cylinder," Holmes said, "designed for the secure transport of rolled papers, military design. I have seen identical containers used for the transfer of dispatches in the field. Someone has been using this tunnel network not merely for transit, but for exchange. Documents are being placed here and collected by another party. We are looking at a dead drop, Watson, and a well-established one." Lestrade looked from the cylinder to the tunnel stretching ahead of us into darkness. "You're saying someone is smuggling documents through the underground?" "I am saying that beneath the Northern Line there exists a network of passages, forgotten by the public, erased from the official surveys, known only to someone with access to the original Victorian construction plans, and that this network is being used as a covert transport system. Edward Mallory, a man who handled War Office accounts, discovered this operation. He attempted to report it, and he was killed for his trouble, silently, professionally, and by a man who carries military weapons, wears military boots, and moves through these tunnels with the confidence of someone who has been using them for a very long time." Holmes turned the brass cylinder over in his hands, his expression grave. "This is not a murder case, Lestrade. Or rather, it is, but the murder is merely the visible surface of something far larger and far more dangerous. Someone with military authority is running an espionage operation beneath London, and they are eliminating anyone who threatens to expose it." We retraced our steps in silence. At the false wall, Holmes paused and examined the mechanism by which the bricks had been loosened, a simple but effective system of wooden wedges that allowed the section to be pushed open from either side and resealed to appear solid. He photographed the arrangement with a small camera he had brought for the purpose, then ensured the passage was returned to its concealed state. Emerging into the service tunnel and then the station itself felt like surfacing from deep water. The noise and light of the functioning underground, the rattle of trains, the voices of passengers, the electric hum of the platform lamps, seemed almost violent after the silence below. On the platform, Holmes paused and turned to Lestrade. "I want the name of every person who has accessed the original 1867 engineering surveys of this section of the Northern Line. Those surveys are the only documents that map these hidden passages. Someone obtained them, or removed them entirely, to facilitate this operation. Find the surveys, Lestrade, and you will find the architect of everything we have seen today." Lestrade departed with the grim determination of a man who has realized his case is considerably larger than he had been prepared for. Holmes and I took a cab back to Baker Street. In the sitting room, Holmes pinned the plaster cast of the boot prints to a board beside the fireplace and sat regarding them with his pipe wreathed in smoke. "A military garrote," he said, as though reciting an inventory. "Military-grade weapon oil. Military boot prints with a distinctive injury pattern. A courier cylinder of military design. And a tunnel network that could only have been accessed through military survey records." He drew on his pipe. "Every thread leads back to the same institution, Watson. The War Office. And yet the War Office is also the victim. It is their documents being stolen. Their consultant who was murdered. We are looking for a man who serves the Crown and simultaneously betrays it. A man trusted enough to move freely through the most sensitive corridors of British intelligence and ruthless enough to kill 3 times over to protect his secret." I looked at him sharply. 3 times? "There's been only one murder, Holmes." He met my gaze steadily. "One murder so far, but consider the pattern. Mallory discovered the operation and was killed. Thomas Keegan, the night watchman, saw the phantom. He is the only living witness. How long do you suppose our killer will allow that witness to remain living?" A cold certainty settled over me. "We must warn Keegan." "We must do considerably more than warn him," Holmes said. "We must find the man behind the mask before he decides that silence is cheaper than risk. And we are working, Watson, against a mind that has planned this operation for months, perhaps years, with the discipline and patience of a military campaign." He set down his pipe and reached for the evening edition. "Somewhere in London tonight, a decorated officer is reading these same headlines about the Northern Line phantom. And he is smiling, Watson, because every word written about ghosts is a word not written about him." Chapter 3. The Man Who Saw the Ghost. Thomas Keegan lived in a narrow terrace house on Plender Street, a short walk from Mornington Crescent Station, and an even shorter walk from the tunnels that had become, in the span of a single week, the most discussed stretch of railway in London. Holmes and I arrived at his door shortly after 9 the following morning. The fog had lifted overnight, replaced by a bitter wind that drove scraps of newspaper along the gutters and turned the breath of every passing stranger into a brief white ghost of its own. Keegan answered the door himself. He was a wiry man of perhaps 55, with deep-set eyes and the weathered complexion of someone who has spent the better part of his adult life underground. His handshake was firm but brief, and he ushered us inside with the hurried manner of a man who has been expecting visitors he would rather not receive. The parlour was small and scrupulously clean, and on the mantelpiece stood a row of service commendations from the Metropolitan Railway, 23 years of dependable employment, framed and polished and arranged with the pride of a man whose reputation was the only wealth he possessed. "I know why you're here, Mr. Holmes," Keegan said, before either of us had spoken. "And I'll tell you what I told the police, and what I told my supervisor, and what I've told every reporter who's come knocking since Tuesday. I saw what I saw. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't dreaming, and I've worked those tunnels long enough to know when something isn't right. I have not come to challenge your account, Mr. Keegan," Holmes said. "I have come to understand it. You are, at this moment, the only person alive who has seen the figure in the tunnels. That makes you valuable to me. And, I must be frank, potentially dangerous to the figure himself." Something shifted behind Keegan's eyes, a recognition, perhaps, that the fear he had been carrying since that night had a more tangible basis than ghosts. He sat down heavily and gestured for us to do the same. 11:15, he began. "Give or take a few minutes. I was doing my rounds on the southbound platform, checking the signal lamps, making sure the track was clear for the last scheduled maintenance train. The platform was empty. It always is at that hour. The last passenger service runs at 10:30, and after that the station belongs to us. The watchmen, the sweepers, the the track inspectors. It's quiet. You get used to the quiet. He paused, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the parlour wall, seeing the tunnel again. I was at the far end of the platform, not near the mouth of the tunnel. There's a stretch of track there that curves away to the south, and beyond the curve there's a maintenance corridor, a short passage that leads to the old ventilation shafts. That's where I saw him, standing just inside the corridor mouth, maybe 30 yards from where I was. A tall man. Very tall. 6'2" at least, maybe more. Wearing a long, dark coat, heavy, the kind you see in old photographs, and a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low. I couldn't see his face. The lantern, Holmes prompted, in his right hand, an old oil lantern, the kind we used before the electric came in. It gave off a yellowish light, very steady, not like a candle or a match. He was holding it out in front of him, like he was looking for something on the ground. Or illuminating his path, Holmes said. What happened next? I shouted, "Oi, you there!" Something like that. He didn't move, didn't turn, didn't flinch. I shouted again and started walking toward him. And then, Mr. Holmes, I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you exactly what I saw. He turned and walked into the wall. Not through a door. There was no door. He walked toward the brickwork, and he was simply gone. The lantern light went out like a candle being snuffed, and there was nothing, just the dark and the sound of my own breathing. How many seconds between your first shout and his disappearance? Keegan considered. 8, perhaps 10, no more. And then the 11:20 maintenance train came through. The noise filled the whole tunnel. You can't hear yourself think when a train passes at close range. By the time it cleared, maybe 40 seconds later, the corridor was empty. No figure, no light, nothing. I went to the spot where he'd been standing. The brickwork was solid. I pressed on it, knocked on it. Nothing moved. There was no opening, no gap, no door. Just wall. Holmes leaned forward. Mr. Keegan, I want you to think very carefully about what I am about to ask you. The corridor where you saw this figure, is it near any of the sealed maintenance doors that connect to the older sections of the tunnel system? Keegan frowned. There's an old door about 15 feet past the corridor entrance. It's been bolted shut since before I started. Leads to one of the original ventilation passages from the first construction. Nobody uses it. Nobody's supposed to. Have you ever checked whether that door is still secure? A pause. It's always been locked. I walk past it every night. I've never had reason to... He stopped. Something was reorganizing itself behind his eyes. You're saying he went through the door, not the wall. He went through the door and I couldn't see it in the dark because the lantern went out. I am saying, Holmes replied, that if this is truly a phantom, Mr. Keegan, then why does it only appear near doors? The question hung in the air of the small parlour like smoke. Keegan stared at Holmes, and I watched a man's understanding of what had happened to him transform utterly, from the supernatural to the mechanical, from the inexplicable to the terrifyingly deliberate. He wanted me to think it was a ghost, Keegan said slowly. He needs everyone to think it is a ghost. The newspapers are cooperating splendidly. Every story about a phantom on the Northern Line is another layer of protection for a man who is using those tunnels for purposes that require absolute secrecy. Your sighting was not an accident. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the ghost legend turns your testimony from evidence into folklore. No investigator takes a ghost story seriously. That, Mr. Keegan, is the purpose of the performance. We left Keegan with a firm instruction to vary his routines, avoid the tunnels alone at night, and report any approach by strangers, however friendly, to Holmes directly. As we stepped onto Plender Street, I saw Holmes glance back at the house with an expression I'd come to recognize as private concern carefully disguised as professional calculation. "He is in danger," I said. "He is the only witness," Holmes replied. "And our killer has already demonstrated that witnesses are a commodity he does not tolerate." Our next visit that morning was to the Northern Line's night shift railway supervisor, Reginald Marsh. Holmes had arranged the interview through Lestrade, who had provided us with Marsh's work address at the railway offices near Camden town. Marsh received us in a small, overheated office cluttered with shift rosters, incident logs, and the accumulated paperwork of a man responsible for the safe operation of one of London's busiest underground routes between the hours of 11 at night and 5 in the morning. He was a compact man of perhaps 45, with thinning hair oiled flat against his skull, and a moustache trimmed with the geometric precision of someone who valued control over small things. He shook our hands with the correct pressure and duration, offered us tea with the correct degree of hospitality, and answered our opening questions with the correct balance of helpfulness and professional caution. In short, he performed the role of the cooperative witness with a polish that immediately made me suspicious. Holmes asked about the sealed tunnels. Marsh produced a set of infrastructure maps and explained, fluently and at length, that the Northern Line contained numerous decommissioned passages dating from the original Victorian construction. All had been sealed according to standard procedure. All were inspected annually. None had been breached. "And the maintenance doors?" Holmes asked. "The access points between the active tunnels and the sealed sections?" "Locked and checked on a monthly cycle," Marsh said. "I have the inspection logs if you'd like to see them." "I would, and I would also like to know who holds keys to those doors." "Myself, the day shift supervisor, and the chief maintenance engineer. 3 sets. All accounted for." Holmes nodded as though satisfied, but I noticed that throughout this entire exchange Marsh's hands, resting on the desk before him, had not been still for a single moment. His fingers drummed lightly on the wood, adjusted the angle of a pen, straightened a stack of papers that needed no straightening. These were the hands of a man who was managing not just the conversation, but his own body's instinct to betray him. Holmes noticed too. He said nothing about it. He thanked Marsh for his time, accepted copies of the inspection logs, and we departed. On the pavement outside, Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "That man is lying." "About the doors?" "About everything that matters. The inspection logs will be immaculate, I'm certain of it. Too immaculate. A man who keeps perfect records of doors he never actually checks is a man who has been paid to maintain an illusion of security while allowing the security itself to be quietly dismantled. Marsh knows those tunnels are being used. He may not know by whom or for what purpose, but he knows, and he has been compensated handsomely for his ignorance. Our final visit of the morning took us to the city offices of the late Edward Mallory, where we encountered a woman whose presence Holmes had anticipated, and whose candour, when it arrived, was bracing enough to make even my friend pause. Irene Calder was waiting for us in the reception area, though we had not announced our visit. She was a woman of 40 or so, dark-haired, sharp-featured, dressed in mourning black that looked more like armour than grief. She rose when we entered and extended her hand with the directness of a woman accustomed to conducting business with men who underestimated her. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I assumed you would come here eventually. I have been Edward Mallory's business partner for 9 years and his adversary for the last 18 months. I imagine you have questions." "Several," Holmes admitted. "Then let me save you time. Yes, I had motive. Edward dissolved our partnership under terms that cost me a great deal of money and nearly all of my professional reputation. Yes, I threatened legal action. Yes, half of London heard me do so. And no, I did not kill him, though I confess the thought was not entirely foreign to me." She said this with a coolness that was either admirable honesty or a very convincing performance. "What I can tell you, Mr. Holmes, is that in the months before his death, Edward became secretive in ways that went beyond our dispute. Late-night meetings, unexplained absences. He began keeping files I was not permitted to see, unusual for a man whose entire professional life had been organised around shared access and transparent record-keeping. I believed he was concealing assets to disadvantage me in the settlement. I now suspect he was concealing something else entirely. What led you to that suspicion? Irene opened her bag and produced a single sheet of paper, a hand-drawn map, rough but detailed, showing a section of tunnel with annotated access points and dates. I found this in Edward's private desk 3 weeks before he died. I did not understand it then. I believe I am beginning to understand it now. Holmes took the map and studied it. I watched his eyes move across the annotations, dates, times, brief notations in Mallory's careful hand. Whatever he read there deepened the lines of his face by a fraction. Miss Calder, you said Edward kept files you were not permitted to see. Do you know where those files are now? I do not, but I know they were not in this office when I arrived this morning. Someone has been here before us, Mr. Holmes. Edward's private drawer has been forced open and emptied. Holmes folded the map and placed it in his breast pocket. As we left, I asked him what the day's interviews had told him. Not 3 people, he said, and not one of them is telling the full truth. Keegan saw something real and is only now understanding what it means. Marsh knows far more than he admits and is terrified of whoever is paying him. And Irene Calder is the most dangerous kind of witness, an intelligent woman who has assembled half the puzzle and is determined to assemble the rest, regardless of the personal risk. He hailed a cab, his expression grim. We are surrounded by liars, Watson. The only question is which of them is also a murderer, and whether we can answer that question before the murderer decides there are too many people who know too much. Chapter 4. A Shot at Camden Town. 5 days had passed since the discovery of Edward Mallory's body, and London had done what London does best with a mystery it cannot solve. It had turned it into entertainment. The phantom of the Northern Line was now a fixture of public conversation, discussed in pubs and drawing rooms with equal enthusiasm and equal ignorance. Street vendors near the underground stations had begun selling penny broadsides, featuring lurid illustrations of a spectral figure stalking the tunnels beneath the city. A music hall comedian in Islington had incorporated the phantom into his act. The Evening Standard ran a series on the history of hauntings on the London Underground, complete with testimonials from railway workers who claimed to have seen ghostly figures on various lines over the past 30 years, none of which Holmes noted with acid amusement. Had attracted the slightest public interest until a dead body made the subject profitable. Holmes himself had spent the intervening days in a state of intense but largely invisible activity. He sent and received a dozen telegrams daily. He spent an entire afternoon at the British Museum reading room, consulting Victorian engineering journals. He visited the Reform Club twice, not as a guest, but as an observer, sitting in the public reading room with a newspaper and watching the comings and goings of the membership with an attention that would have alarmed anyone who noticed it. He did not explain these excursions to me, and I did not ask. I had learned over years of partnership that Holmes's investigations often resembled icebergs. The visible portion represented a small fraction of the mass, and the submerged work proceeded according to a logic that only revealed itself when he was ready. What he did share with me was his growing concern for Thomas Keegan. The killer's pattern is operational, not emotional, Holmes said on the evening of the 4th day, pacing before the fireplace with the restless energy of a man who senses danger approaching, but cannot yet see its shape. Mallory was killed because he discovered the espionage operation. Keegan saw the phantom, the killer himself, in costume, entering or exiting the tunnels. As long as Keegan's account is dismissed as a ghost story, he is safe. But Keegan has now spoken to the police. He has spoken to us. word travels. If our killer learns that Keegan's testimony is being taken seriously, that someone is connecting the ghost sighting to the murder rather than treating it as folklore, then Keegan becomes a liability, and this man does not tolerate liabilities. I suggested we arrange police protection. Holmes shook his head. A uniformed constable outside Keegan's door announces to the world, and to our killer, that Keegan is considered a significant witness. It accelerates the very danger we are trying to prevent. No, what Keegan needs is not a guard but a resolution. We must identify the killer before the killer identifies Keegan as a threat worth eliminating. He paused at the window, looking out at the darkened street. I have asked Keegan to vary his shifts. He has agreed, but he is a proud man, Watson, and a stubborn one. Our 23 years walking those tunnels in the dark. He will not be kept from his work by fear, his own or anyone else's. On the morning of the 6th day, we learned that Holmes's fears had been precisely, horribly correct. Lestrade arrived at Baker Street at 7 o'clock, unannounced and ashen. He did not sit down. He stood in the doorway of our sitting room with his hat in his hands and delivered the news in a voice stripped of everything except the bare facts. Thomas Keegan had been found dead at Camden town station at approximately midnight. He had been shot once in the chest at close range. The wound was clean, the bullet recovered. No one had heard the shot. A southbound train had been passing through the station at the estimated time of death, and its noise had swallowed everything. Keegan's body was discovered by a colleague 40 minutes later, slumped against the wall of a maintenance corridor less than 20 yards from the platform edge. Holmes received this news in silence. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality I had heard only a handful of times in all our years together. A cold, controlled fury directed not outward but inward at himself. I was too slow, he said. I knew this would happen, and I was too slow to prevent it. You couldn't have known the timing, Holmes, I said. I knew the logic. The timing was merely a detail I failed to anticipate. He reached for his coat. Take us to Camden Town, Lestrade, and tell me everything. At the station, we descended to the platform level, which had been sealed since the discovery of the body. Keegan lay where he had fallen, or rather, the outline of his position remained, the body itself having been moved to the mortuary an hour earlier. But the bloodstain was still visible on the tiled wall, a dark, irregular bloom at chest height, already browning at the edges. Holmes examined the scene with the meticulous attention he brought to every crime, but I could see that this examination carried a different weight. He had spoken to Keegan. He had warned Keegan. He had sat in Keegan's parlour and seen the service commendations on the mantelpiece and the fear behind the steady eyes. This was no longer an abstract exercise in deduction. The failure was personal. Yet the bullet had been recovered from the wall behind where Keegan fell. It had passed through his body and embedded itself in the tile. Holmes examined the entry point with his magnifying glass, then produced a small compass and a folding rule from his pocket. He measured angles. He made notations. He stood at the point where Keegan's body had been found, then turned and walked slowly backward along the corridor, his eyes fixed on the bloodstain and the bullet hole, triangulating the position of the shooter. Close range, he said. No more than 8 feet. The shot entered slightly left of centre, not directly from the front, but from a position offset to the left. The same leftward angle we observed in the garret marks on Mallory, though that may be coincidence. It may also not be. He held up the bullet, which Lestrade had provided in a small evidence envelope. It was a revolver round, heavy caliber, military specification. Holmes turned it in the light. This is not a civilian bullet, Lestrade. The caliber, the jacket, the weight. This is military ordnance, consistent with a sidearm issued to officers of field intelligence. Combined with the suppressor oil I identified at the first crime scene, We are looking at a man who carries a weapon that is, for all practical purposes, silent, and who chose to fire it at the precise moment a train was passing through the station. Even without a suppressor, the shot would have been inaudible. With one, it would have been imperceptible. Our killer understands timing as well as he understands weapons. The same man who killed Mallory, Lestrade said. It was no longer a question. The same man. He owned the same military background, the same operational discipline, and now the same motive, the elimination of anyone who poses a threat to whatever is happening in those tunnels. A constable approached and informed Lestrade that a witness had been located, a fellow night watchman named Peter Garvey, who had spoken to Keegan approximately 30 minutes before the estimated time of death. Garvey was waiting in the station master's office, pale and visibly shaken. Holmes asked to speak with him immediately. Garvey was a younger man than Keegan, nervous by temperament, and the events of the night had driven his natural anxiety to the edge of panic. He spoke rapidly, his words tumbling over one another. Tom came on shift at 10. Normal time, he seemed not himself, distracted. He told me he'd been thinking about what he saw, the phantom. Like he said he'd worked something out, something about the doors. He didn't explain. Then around 11:30 he said something I didn't understand at the time. What did he say? Holmes asked. Garvey swallowed. He said, "The ghost is not alone tonight." I asked him what he meant. He said he'd seen a man on the platform, well-dressed, foreign-looking, watching the tunnel entrance. Just standing there, not waiting for a train, not going anywhere. Just watching. Tom said it was the second time he'd seen the same man near the tunnels late at night. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "This foreign gentleman," Holmes said. Did Keegan describe him further? "Tallish, dark hair, good coat. Tom said he looked like a diplomat or something, carried himself like money." After we left Garvey, Holmes stood on the platform in silence for a full minute. Then he turned to me and said, very quietly, "Watson, do you recall the crowd outside Mornington Crescent the morning we examined Mallory's body?" The onlookers near the station entrance, I thought back. There were several dozen people, commuters, newspaper sellers, and a well-dressed foreign gentleman standing slightly apart, observing the police activity with unusual interest. The memory surfaced with a sharpness that surprised me. The man at the cordon, tall, dark-haired, expensively dressed, watching the station entrance with the detached attentiveness of someone conducting an assessment rather than satisfying curiosity. I had noticed him. I'd even noted it in passing. But in the rush of events, the observation had sunk beneath the surface of my attention. "I remember him," I said. "As do I. And unless I am very much mistaken, so did Thomas Keegan, on at least 2 separate occasions. A foreign gentleman of diplomatic bearing, appearing near Northern Line stations on nights when the tunnels are active. He is not the killer, Watson. The killer is British, military trained, and operates alone. But this man is connected to the operation, and his repeated presence near the tunnel access points suggests he is there to collect, not to deliver." Holmes had Lestrade dispatch inquiries to the Metropolitan Police's Foreign Nationals Registry. By that evening, the man had been identified. Eric Brenner, aged 38, an attaché at the Prussian Embassy in Carlton House Terrace. His diplomatic credentials were in order. His official function was described as cultural liaison, as he had been resident in London for 14 months. Cultural liaison, Holmes repeated, with the particular inflection he reserved for statements he considered insulting to his intelligence. A Prussian cultural attaché who spends his evenings loitering near underground maintenance corridors. The culture he is liaising with, Watson, is not art or literature. It is the culture of intelligence, the quiet exchange of information between a foreign power and a traitor within the British establishment. He filled his pipe and sank into his chair. The evening had settled over Baker Street, and the fire threw long shadows across the cluttered sitting room. On the mantelpiece, the plaster casts of the killer's boot prints stood like silent accusations. The same asymmetric left heel wear, the same military tread, the same unhesitating stride. And now, somewhere in London, the man who had made those prints was reading the evening papers and learning that his phantom legend was holding firm, that the investigation was chasing ghosts, while the real work continued undisturbed beneath the city. "Our killer is eliminating witnesses," Holmes said. "This is no phantom haunting. This is a campaign of silencing. Mallory discovered the operation. Keegan saw the operative. Both are now dead. The question is not whether there will be a third killing, Watson. The question is who. Someone else, somewhere in London, knows something, or is about to discover something, that this man cannot afford to have known, and we are running out of time to find them before he does." He set down his pipe and stared into the fire. 2 men dead, both killed with military precision, military weapons, a military timing, both connected to the tunnels beneath the Northern Line, and a Prussian diplomat collecting intelligence at midnight, 300 feet below the streets of London. He paused. "We are not investigating a murder, Watson. We are investigating a war, a secret war fought in the dark beneath the feet of a city that does not know it is a battlefield." Chapter 5. The Forgotten Map. The Public Records Office on Chantry Lane was a building designed to discourage curiosity. Its corridors were long and poorly lit, its clerks unhelpful by disposition and impenetrable by training, and its filing system appeared to have been organised by a committee whose members had never met one another and shared no common language. Holmes navigated it with the practised ease of a man who had spent more hours in government archives than most civil servants, and within 20 minutes of our arrival he had located the department responsible for municipal engineering surveys and was seated at a long oak table with a request slip in his hand. "The 1867 Northern Line Tunnel Survey," he told the clerk, a thin, suspicious man who examined Holmes's credentials as though expecting them to burst into flame. "The complete engineering survey conducted during the original construction of the deep-level tunnels. It should be filed under Metropolitan Infrastructure, Subsurface Division, reference number 71/43. The clerk disappeared into the stacks. He was gone for a long time. When he returned, his expression had shifted from suspicion to something closer to professional embarrassment. "The document you have requested is not available, sir." "Not available," Holmes repeated. "Meaning it has been checked out?" "Meaning it has been removed from the collection. The survey was requisitioned 18 months ago under a priority access order. It has not been returned." "By whom?" The clerk consulted the requisition log, a heavy leather-bound volume that recorded every document removed from the archive, along with the name and authority of the requesting party. He turned the book toward Holmes and pointed to an entry near the bottom of a crowded page. I leaned over Holmes's shoulder to read it. The entry was brief, the document reference number, the date of requisition, March of 1893, and a single authorizing stamp. Not a name, not a signature. A stamp pressed in dark blue ink, bearing the unmistakable crown and sword insignia of the War Office. "Someone with War Office authority," Holmes said quietly, "removed the only complete map of every maintenance passage, sealed tunnel, and service door beneath the Northern Line, 18 months ago, precisely the period during which, according to the evidence, the tunnel network has been in active covert use." He copied the requisition details into his notebook, thanked the clerk with a courtesy that clearly surprised the man, and we departed into the grey morning. "This is the 7th clue," Holmes said as we walked toward the Strand, "and in some ways the most significant. The garrote, the oil, the boot prints, the courier cylinder, the timing correlation, the bullet trajectory, all of these tell us what the killer is. The missing survey tells us what he has done. He has not merely exploited an existing vulnerability. He has systematically prepared the ground. He identified the tunnel network, obtained the only map that charts its full extent, removed that map from public access to ensure no one else could follow his routes, and established an operational infrastructure, dead drops, access points, bribed personnel, that has been functioning without detection for nearly 2 years. This is not improvisation, Watson. This is a campaign. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately composed a telegram to his brother Mycroft. I had met Mycroft Holmes on several occasions, a man of formidable intellect and even more formidable lethargy, who occupied an undefined but clearly powerful position within the British government. Holmes once told me that Mycroft occasionally was the British government, in the sense that certain decisions of extraordinary sensitivity passed through his hands before reaching any minister. Their relationship was complex, a mutual respect sharpened by mutual exasperation. But when Holmes required access to the corridors of state, Mycroft was the only door that opened without resistance. The reply came within 2 hours, delivered not by telegram but by a silent, unsmiling man in a dark suit, who handed Holmes a sealed envelope and departed without a word. Holmes read the contents, then read them again, then set the letter on the table between us. Mycroft confirms what I suspected. Classified documents have been disappearing from the War Office for months. Not originals, which would trigger immediate alarm, but copies. Someone with access to sensitive materials has been duplicating dispatches, intelligence summaries, and strategic assessments, and the copies have been vanishing into thin air. The War Office has been conducting a quiet internal investigation, but has made no progress. They do not know who is responsible, how the documents are leaving the building, or where they are going. "But you know where they are going," I said, "through the tunnels." "Through the tunnels, into brass cylinders, deposited at dead drop points beneath the Northern Line, and collected by Eric Brenner, or someone in his network. The tunnel system is the delivery mechanism, invisible, untraceable, and completely disconnected from any conventional method of surveillance. No courier to follow, no post to intercept, no telegraph to tap. The documents simply disappear from the War Office and reappear hours later in the hands of a Prussian intelligence operative who never meets the supplier and cannot identify him. It is, I must admit, an elegant system." "You sound almost admiring." "I admire competence, Watson, even in the service of treason. Whoever designed this operation possesses a first-rate military mind, extensive knowledge of underground London, and sufficient authority within the War Office to access classified materials without arousing suspicion. The circle of people who possess all three qualities is extremely small." Holmes paused, his gaze drifting to the window and the rooftops beyond. "Mycroft has provided me with something else, the War Office dispatch schedules for the past 6 months, dates and times of every classified courier dispatch. If my theory is correct, the dates of tunnel activity, and of the murders, will correlate precisely with these schedules. The killer does not operate randomly. He operates on a timetable dictated by the availability of documents worth stealing." He spread the dispatch schedules across the table and spent the remainder of the afternoon cross-referencing them with the dates recorded on Irene Calder's map, the timeline of Keegan's phantom sighting, and the estimated times of both murders. I watched him work, his pen moving between columns of figures with the speed and certainty of a man playing a game whose rules only he could see. By evening, the correlation was undeniable. At every significant date on Calder's map, every night Edward Mallory had noted unusual tunnel activity, fell within 48 hours of a War Office dispatch. Keegan's phantom sighting occurred on the same night as a priority intelligence summary. Both murders took place within 2 hours of scheduled courier dispatches. The pattern was absolute. "He kills on working nights," Holmes said. not because he is compelled to, but because he is already underground. The murders are not separate events. They are additional tasks performed during scheduled operations. He enters the tunnels to collect documents, and if a threat has presented itself since his last visit, he eliminates it in the same excursion. Economy of movement, economy of risk. One trip, multiple objectives. It is military thinking, Watson, applied to murder. The following morning, Holmes arranged, through Mycroft's authority, a meeting with the War Office liaison for underground infrastructure. This was not a meeting Holmes had to request. It was one that had, in a sense, been waiting for him. Mycroft's letter had included a name, Colonel Marcus Vane, a decorated veteran of the Afghan campaign, currently serving as an advisor on military intelligence to the Secretary of State for War. Mycroft described him as one of the most capable minds in the service, a man whose judgment was trusted implicitly by ministers, generals and intelligence chiefs alike. Utterly reliable, Mycroft had written. If anyone can help you navigate the War Office angle of this matter, it is Vane. I shall arrange an introduction. Holmes read this endorsement without expression. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. Then he returned to the table where the dispatch schedules lay spread like a battlefield map and stood looking down at them for a long time. "Watson," he said at last, "I want you to consider something. We are looking for a man with military training, military weapons, and military authority. A man who can access classified documents without arousing suspicion. A man who possesses detailed knowledge of the tunnel network, knowledge that could only come from the very engineering surveys that have been removed from the public records under a War Office stamp. A man whose operational schedule aligns precisely with War Office dispatch timetables. And Mycroft, from his position at the very centre of British intelligence, has just directed me toward the War Office's own expert on underground infrastructure." He turned from the table and met my eyes. Either Mycroft has handed me the man who can solve this case, or he has handed me the man who is at the centre of it. And until I know which, Watson, I intend to treat Colonel Vane with the same careful attention I would give a loaded weapon pointed in an uncertain direction. That afternoon Holmes went alone to the tunnels. He did not invite me and did not explain his purpose. He returned after dark, his clothes streaked with dust and his hands blackened, carrying something wrapped in a handkerchief. He set it on the chemical table and unwrapped it with the care of a man handling evidence that might determine the outcome of the entire investigation. Yet it was a second brass cylinder, identical in design to the one he had discovered on our previous underground expedition. This one too was empty, but when Holmes unscrewed the cap and held the open end beneath the lamp, I could see a faint residue on the interior surface, the ghost of ink, recently dried, and a single human hair caught in the threads of the cap. 2 dead drops, Holmes said, 2 separate exchange points in the tunnel network, both recently active, both designed for the transfer of rolled documents. The operation is not a single courier route. It is a system, Watson. Multiple points, multiple exchanges maintained over months, and somewhere above us, within walking distance of a War Office desk, sits the man who designed it. He held the cylinder up to the light, turning it slowly. This is not about ghosts or revenge. Someone is moving documents beneath London, state secrets, military intelligence, the plans and strategies upon which the security of the Empire depends, and killing anyone who threatens to expose the route. 2 men are dead. A Prussian diplomat collects the product, a railway supervisor keeps the doors unlocked, and the architect of it all walks freely through the most trusted circles of the British establishment, protected by his rank, his reputation, and a ghost story that keeps the world looking in the wrong direction. He set the cylinder down and reached for his pipe. "Tomorrow we dine with Colonel Vane, and I shall listen very carefully, Watson, to every word that a reliable man chooses to say, and to every word he chooses not to." Chapter 6. The Colonel's Table. The Reform Club occupied a handsome palazzo on Pall Mall, its Portland stone facade projecting the quiet confidence of an institution that had never doubted its own importance and saw no reason to begin. Holmes and I arrived at 7:30 on a cold, clear evening. The fog had finally broken, and London lay exposed beneath a sky crowded with stars that the city's gaslight rendered pale and distant. A uniformed porter received us in the entrance hall and conducted us through corridors of polished mahogany and gilt-frame portraits to a private dining room on the first floor, where Colonel Marcus Vane was already waiting. He rose as we entered, and my first impression was of a man who had been designed by nature for the specific purpose of inspiring trust. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the lean, straight-backed carriage of a career soldier, and a face that balanced authority with warmth. Strong jaw, clear blue eyes, grey hair cropped short and neat. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, and his smile reached his eyes with a naturalness that most politicians would have envied and none could have replicated. He wore evening dress with the ease of a man equally comfortable in a ballroom or a battlefield, and when he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to by people who mattered. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am delighted to meet you both. Mycroft speaks of you in terms that, coming from a man who rarely speaks well of anyone, constitute the highest possible praise." He gestured to the table, which had been set for 3 with the understated elegance the Reform Club brought to all things. "Please, sit. I have taken the liberty of ordering the wine. I hope you'll forgive the presumption." We sat. The wine was poured, a claret of exceptional quality, and Vane raised his glass. He raised it, I noticed, with his left hand. A small thing, a social detail of no apparent significance. I noted it in passing as one notes any minor departure from convention, and thought nothing more of it. Holmes, however, held Vane's gaze for a fraction of a second longer than the toast required. His eyes dropped to Vane's left hand, lingered there for an instant so brief that only someone watching for it, as I was, from long habit, would have caught it, and then returned to Vane's face with an expression of perfectly calibrated cordiality. Whatever he had observed, he filed it away without comment. "Colonel Vane," Holmes began, after the first course had been served, "I understand you are the War Office's principal advisor on matters relating to underground infrastructure." "Among other things," Vane said. "My portfolio is rather broad. Military intelligence encompasses a wide range of concerns, and underground passages are merely one of them. But yes, I have a particular interest in the subject. During the Afghan campaign, we made extensive use of tunnel systems, both natural cave networks and purpose-built passages, for the movement of troops and supplies. The experience left me with a deep appreciation for the strategic value of what lies beneath the surface. London, as it happens, sits atop one of the most extensive underground networks in the world. Most of it forgotten, all of it potentially useful." "Useful for what purposes?" Holmes asked. "In theory, military staging, emergency evacuation, secure communications. In practice, the tunnels have been neglected for decades. The government surveys are incomplete, the access points are poorly maintained, and institutional knowledge of the network has been allowed to atrophy. I have been arguing for years that a comprehensive resurvey of the underground system should be a priority. So far my arguments have fallen on deaf ears." He smiled, a rueful, self-deprecating expression that invited sympathy. "The War Office, Mr. Holmes, is an institution that excels at fighting the last war and ignoring the next one. Underground infrastructure is not glamorous. It does not involve cavalry charges or naval engagements, and so it remains, quite literally, beneath notice." "And yet someone has noticed," Holmes said. "The tunnels beneath the Northern Line are being used, actively recently, and with considerable sophistication." Vane's expression shifted to one of careful concern. "So, Mycroft indicated. It is deeply troubling. The idea that someone has exploited the very vulnerabilities I have been warning about. Well, it is a bit of vindication, if vindication it is. You are familiar with the specific tunnel sections involved? In general terms, yes. The Northern Line was constructed in stages between 1860 and 1877, and the original deep-level tunnels included a network of ventilation shafts, service passages, and maintenance corridors that were sealed during subsequent modernisation. The 1867 survey, the definitive map of the original construction, documents every passage in detail. If someone wanted to navigate the hidden sections of the network, that survey would be indispensable. Holmes nodded. The survey has been removed from the Public Records Office. The requisition bears a War Office stamp. Vane's eyebrows rose. Does it indeed? That is alarming. A great many documents pass through the War Office, Mr. Holmes, and I regret to say that our record-keeping is not always what it should be. But a complete engineering survey of the London Underground being requisitioned and not returned, that suggests someone within the establishment is directly involved. That is precisely my conclusion, Holmes said. The second course arrived, roast pheasant, impeccably prepared, and the conversation turned at Vane's direction to the history of the tunnel system itself. He spoke with fluency and evident enthusiasm, describing the engineering challenges of the original construction, the personalities of the Victorian engineers who had designed the network, and the remarkable extent of the passages that lay forgotten beneath the modern city. It was an impressive performance, knowledgeable, engaging, generous with detail, and it had the quality of a man sharing a genuine passion rather than reciting prepared material. A man can traverse half of London in 90 minutes if he knows the shortcuts, Vane remarked at one point, reaching for the wine with his left hand once more. The Victorians built far more than they needed. Their tunnels connect stations, sewers, government buildings, even private residences in some cases. It is an invisible city, Mr. Holmes. A mirror London, running beneath the one we see. 90 minutes, Holmes repeated, as though committing the figure to memory. That is a remarkably specific estimate, Colonel. Vane laughed. I have walked a few of those passages myself in the course of my surveys. Not the Northern Line sections. Those have been sealed for decades, and I confess I have never had occasion to venture that far. But the Westminster tunnels, the Whitehall connections, yes. I know those routes well enough to estimate travel times with reasonable accuracy. Holmes smiled and said nothing. The conversation moved on. Over dessert, Holmes steered the discussion toward the victims. Vane listened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy as Holmes described Edward Mallory's War Office connections and Thomas Keegan's phantom sighting. He asked thoughtful questions. He offered to review his own files for any information that might assist the investigation. He expressed particular concern about the implications of an espionage operation running through the tunnel system. If classified documents are being transferred underground, Vane said, his tone grave, then the damage to national security could be immense. The tunnel network is, by its nature, beyond the reach of conventional surveillance. No telegraph intercepts, no postal inspections, no customs checks. A perfect blind spot. Whoever designed this operation understood that. They understood a great deal, Holmes agreed. They understood the tunnels. They understood the War Office. And they understood that the most effective form of concealment is not secrecy, but misdirection. The Phantom, Vane said, nodding. Yes, ingenious, in a dark sort of way. Give the public a ghost to talk about, and no one asks what a living man might be doing in the same tunnels. Fear as camouflage. It is, and I say this with no admiration for the morality involved, a very sound tactical principle. You speak as a military man. I am a military man, Mr. Holmes. I recognize good strategy even when it serves a terrible purpose. That does not mean I approve of it. Quite the opposite. It means I understand how dangerous the strategist is. We departed the Reform Club shortly before 11. The night was cold and still, and our breath clouded in the lamplight as Holmes and I walked east along Pall Mall. Holmes was silent for several minutes, an inward silence, not the companionable quiet of a man with nothing to say, but the concentrated stillness of a man with too much to process, and no intention of sharing it prematurely. At last I spoke. "What did you make of him?" "He is charming," Holmes said. "He is knowledgeable. He is cooperative. He volunteered information freely, expressed appropriate concern, and offered his assistance without being asked. He did everything a helpful, patriotic, innocent man would do in his position." "And that troubles you?" "It does not trouble me, Watson. It interests me. When a man performs innocence with such precision, it is worth asking whether it is innocence or a performance." He walked a few more paces in silence. "Two details. The first, his left hand. Colonel Vane is left-handed. He raised his glass with his left hand, reached for the wine with his left hand, gestured with his left hand throughout the evening. A small thing, except that the bullet wounds on Thomas Keegan entered from a slightly leftward angle, consistent with a left-handed shooter positioned at close range. The garrote marks on Mallory also suggest a leftward bias in the application of pressure. I noted these asymmetries at the crime scenes, but had no frame of reference. Now I do. "That is circumstantial at best," I said. "It is, which is why I mention it as an observation, not a conclusion. The second detail is more suggestive. Vane told us that a man can traverse half of London in 90 minutes using the underground shortcuts. 90 minutes. I have obtained Colonel Vane's club records for the 3 nights corresponding to the 2 murders and the most recent dispatch date. On each of those evenings, Vane signed the guest book at the Reform Club upon arrival, then disappeared for approximately 90 minutes before being seen again by staff. He claims to have been reading in the library. The club librarian does not recall seeing him. I stopped walking. "You are saying he left the club?" "I am saying there is a 90-minute window on each of the 3 critical nights during which Colonel Vane's whereabouts cannot be verified, and that this window corresponds precisely to his own casual estimate of the time required to traverse London's underground network. He told us the number himself, Watson. Over pheasant and good claret, with a smile on his face, he gave us the exact duration of his absence from his own alibi." Holmes resumed walking, his hands clasped behind his back. "Consider the inventory. A killer with military training and military weapons. Boot prints showing a left-footed gait asymmetry consistent with an old leg injury. A left-handed shooter. A man with intimate knowledge of the tunnel network. A man with War Office authority sufficient to requisition and remove the only complete survey of the Northern Line tunnels. A man whose club records show an unexplained 90-minute gap on every night a murder was committed or a document exchanged. And a man who sat across from us this evening poured wine with his left hand and told us, with the confidence of personal experience, exactly how long it takes to move through the passages he claims never to have entered." He paused beneath a street lamp, his face half in light and half in shadow. "I have been dining with our phantom, Watson, and he has been laughing at us the entire time." Chapter 7. Death Between Stations. Arthur Bell was a man who should have been safe. He was 71 years old, retired for nearly a decade, and lived in a modest flat above a tobacconist's shop in Lambeth, with a ginger cat named Disraeli and a collection of engineering drawings that occupied every horizontal surface not claimed by the cat. He had spent 40 years in the service of the Metropolitan Railway, the last 15 as a senior tunnel engineer, responsible for the maintenance and inspection of deep-level passages throughout the underground network. He knew more about the earth beneath London than any living man, and he had contacted Holmes voluntarily and without prompting to offer his assistance. His letter had arrived at Baker Street 2 days after the Keegan murder, written in the careful, sloping hand of an educated man whose penmanship had been shaped by decades of annotating technical drawings. He introduced himself, explained his credentials, and stated plainly that he had been following the newspaper accounts of the Northern Line phantom with growing alarm, not because he believed in ghosts, but because he recognized in the descriptions of sealed tunnels and hidden passages the specific sections of the network he had personally surveyed and maintained during his years of service. "I know those tunnels, Mr. Holmes," the letter read. "I walked them when they were still in use, and I walked them after they were sealed. I know where every door leads, where every passage connects, and where the official maps are wrong. If someone is using the old network for criminal purposes, I may be the only person alive who can tell you exactly how they are doing it." Holmes had replied immediately, arranging a meeting for the following afternoon. Arthur Bell never kept that appointment. The body was found at 6 o'clock in the morning by a track maintenance crew performing routine inspections of the tunnel between Charing Cross and Waterloo. Bell lay face down in a narrow service alcove, approximately 200 yards from the nearest station platform. He had been shot once, a single round to the chest, close range, the same caliber and the same clean, professional execution that had killed Thomas Keegan. The bullet had entered from the left side, consistent with a left-handed shooter. There were no witnesses. There was no sound. The overnight trains had provided all the acoustic cover the killer required. Beside the body, written in white chalk on the tunnel wall in large, deliberate letters, were 5 words: "The Phantom walks among us." Holmes received the news from Lestrade at 7:30. He dressed in silence, his movements sharp and economical, his face set in an expression that I had learned, over many years, to interpret not as calm, but as the visible surface of a fury so tightly controlled that it resembled composure the way a sealed furnace resembles a cold room. He did not speak during the cab ride to Charing Cross. He did not speak as we descended into the tunnel. He did not speak as he examined the body, the bullet wound, the chalk message, and the surrounding passage with the exhaustive attention he brought to every scene, but which now carried the quality of a man cataloguing evidence not merely to solve a case, but to build a prosecution from which there would be no escape. At last, standing before the chalk message, he spoke. "A ghost has no need to advertise its presence, Watson. This message was written for us, to keep us chasing shadows while the real work continues underground. It is theatrical, it is calculated, and it tells me something important about our killer's state of mind. Which is, he is enjoying himself. The first murder, Mallory, was operational, a necessary elimination performed with professional restraint. The second, Keegan, was defensive, a witness removed before he could become dangerous. But this, the chalk, the staging, the declaration, this is vanity. He is no longer merely protecting his operation. He is performing. He wants the legend to grow. He wants London to whisper about the phantom in the tunnels, and he wants the police to chase that legend while he walks freely above ground. 3 murders in, and he believes himself untouchable." Holmes knelt beside Bell's body and examined his clothing, his hands, and the contents of his pockets with meticulous care. Bell's wallet was intact, money untouched. His watch was still running. In the inside pocket of his coat, Holmes found a small leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with hand-drawn maps of tunnel sections, annotated in the same careful hand as the letter that had arrived at Baker Street. Holmes opened the notebook and studied it in the light of his lamp. Page after page of detailed drawings, cross-sections, elevation profiles, passage dimensions, each annotated with dates and brief notes. The notations were recent. Bell had not been relying on old memories. He had been conducting his own investigation, returning to the tunnels he knew so well and documenting what he found there. "Look at this," Holmes said, holding the notebook toward me. He indicated a page near the back, a map of a tunnel junction approximately half a mile north of our present location. Bell had marked 2 separate sets of footprints in the dust, drawn at different scales and annotated with dates 10 days apart. Beside the larger set, he had written, "Military boots, heavy tread, consistent gait, same individual both visits." Beside the smaller set, lighter shoe, civilian pattern, briefer visit, different individual. 2 people, I said. 2 people using the same tunnel network on different nights. One is our killer. The military boots match the prints we have been tracking since the Mallory murder. The other is someone else. Smaller, lighter. You're wearing civilian shoes. Bell saw what we have been suspecting. This operation involves more than one person. The killer moves the documents underground and deposits them at the dead drop points. The second figure, smaller, lighter, civilian, comes later to collect them. Brenner, I said, almost certainly. The Prussian attaché, collecting intelligence from the dead drops without ever meeting or identifying his supplier. 2 halves of a covert exchange, connected by nothing except brass cylinders, hidden behind loose bricks in a forgotten tunnel. No direct contact, no communication, no evidence of conspiracy except the physical traces left in the dust. Traces that Arthur Bell, a 71-year-old retired engineer with a notebook and a lamp, was clever enough to find and methodical enough to record. Holmes closed the notebook and placed it carefully in his coat. And that is why he is dead. Not because he contacted me. The letter had not yet been answered, and the killer could not have known about it. Bell died because he was in the tunnels, doing exactly what he had done for 40 years. Inspecting, documenting, mapping. He saw the footprints. He noted the patterns. And on one of his visits, he was seen. Or the evidence of his presence was discovered. A fresh set of prints where there should have been none. A disturbed dead drop. Something that told the killer a third party was watching. And so the killer did what he has done each time a threat emerged. He eliminated it, cleanly and without hesitation, and left a chalk message behind to dress the killing in the phantom's clothes. We emerged from the tunnel into the thin morning light. Lestrade was waiting on the platform, his face drawn, his patience visibly eroding under the weight of a case that was growing in scope with each new body. 3 dead, Holmes, Lestrade said. 3 murders in less than a fortnight, all in the underground, all by the same hand. The newspapers are in a frenzy. The commissioner is demanding answers. I cannot keep telling him we are making progress when the only progress being made is by the killer. Then stop telling him that, Holmes said, and tell him instead that this case is no longer a murder investigation. It is a matter of national security. Classified War Office documents are being smuggled through the tunnel network to a foreign intelligence operative. The 3 victims were killed because they each discovered fragments of this operation. The Phantom legend is a deliberate fabrication designed to keep the public and the police focused on ghosts, while the espionage continues undisturbed. And the man responsible is not hiding in the tunnels. He is walking the corridors of Whitehall in uniform, protected by his rank, his reputation, and the assumption that a decorated officer of military intelligence is above suspicion. Lestrade stared at him. You know who it is. I have a theory that is rapidly approaching certainty, but a theory is not evidence, and this man, when we move against him, must be caught with evidence so overwhelming that no amount of charm, influence, or patriotic rhetoric can save him. I need more time, Lestrade, days, not weeks, and I need you to do something that will require considerable nerve. What? Nothing. I need you to do absolutely nothing. No arrests, no public statements, no visible change in the direction of the investigation. Let the newspapers chase the phantom. Let the commissioner fume. And above all, let our killer believe that he remains invisible, because the moment he suspects we are looking at him rather than through him, he will destroy every piece of evidence and disappear into the establishment that protects him. We will have one chance to catch this man Lestrade. One. And it must be on our terms, not his. Lestrade held Holmes's gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, reluctantly, unhappily, but with the trust of a man who had seen Holmes prove right too many times to bet against him now. On the cab ride back to Baker Street, Holmes sat with Bell's notebook open on his knee, turning the pages slowly, reading the dead man's careful annotations as though they were a conversation that had been interrupted and would never be resumed. He was brave, Holmes said quietly. 71 years old, walking those tunnels alone with nothing but a lamp and a notebook, because he believed his knowledge could help. He did not know what he was walking into. He did not understand the scale of what he had discovered. But he went anyway, because the tunnels were his, Watson. He had built them, maintained them, loved them in the way that only an engineer can love the work of his hands. And someone used them for treachery and murder. And Bell could not allow that to stand. He closed the notebook. 3 men dead, a financial consultant who saw the numbers, a watchman who saw the phantom, an engineer who saw the footprints, each killed for the crime of noticing what they were not meant to notice. And the man who killed them will dine tonight at his club, sign the guest book, settle into a leather chair with a brandy and the evening paper, and read about his own legend with the quiet satisfaction of an artist reviewing his finest work. Holmes's jaw tightened. Not for much longer. Chapter 8. The Pattern Emerges. Holmes did not sleep that night. I know this because I did not sleep either, or rather, I slept fitfully in my chair, waking at intervals to find him in the same position at the long table in our sitting room, and surrounded by the accumulated evidence of 3 murders and 6 weeks of investigation, working with the silent, relentless focus of a man who senses that all the scattered threads are finally within reach of a single hand. The table had been cleared of everything except the case materials, arranged in clusters that reflected Holmes's particular taxonomy of evidence. To the left, the physical artefacts, plaster casts of the boot prints from all 3 murder sites, the 2 brass courier cylinders, the sample of machine oil in its sealed dish, the bullets recovered from the bodies of Thomas Keegan and Arthur Bell. In the centre, the documents, Irene Calder's partial tunnel map, the dispatch schedules Mycroft had provided, Arthur Bell's notebook with its hand-drawn passage maps and careful annotations, the requisition slip from the Public Records Office bearing its War Office stamp. To the right, Holmes's own notes, page after page of his angular handwriting, covering observations, measurements, timelines, and cross-references in a shorthand that no one but Holmes himself could decipher. I rose at 6 o'clock and made coffee. Holmes accepted a cup without looking up, drank it without tasting it, and continued working. At 7:30, he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. His face was drawn with fatigue, but his eyes held that particular luminous intensity that I had learned over many years to recognize as the expression of a mind that has finally assembled a complete picture from its fragments. "It is done," he said. "Sit down, Watson. I want to walk you through what I've found. Because I need to hear it spoken aloud. A theory that survives only in the silence of one's own mind is a theory that has not been tested." I sat. Holmes rose and stood before the fireplace, his back to the mantelpiece, and began. "We start with the timing. Mycroft provided me with the War Office dispatch schedules, the dates and times of every classified courier dispatch for the past 6 months. I've cross-referenced these with every known date of tunnel activity, the dates annotated on Irene Calder's map, the phantom sightings reported by Keegan and other railway workers, the entries in Arthur Bell's notebook, and the estimated times of all 3 murders. The correlation is absolute." He moved to the table and laid his finger on the dispatch schedules. Edward Mallory was killed on the night of November the 20th. A priority intelligence dispatch left the War Office at 6 o'clock that evening. Thomas Keegan was killed on the night of November the 25th. A classified strategic assessment was dispatched at 5:30. Arthur Bell was killed on the night of December the 5th. A diplomatic cable summary was dispatched at 7 o'clock. In every case, the murder occurred within 2 hours of the dispatch. In every case, the murder occurred on a night when classified documents were in transit. He paused to let the pattern settle. The killer does not operate on a schedule of his own. He operates on the War Office's schedule. He enters the tunnels on dispatch nights, the nights when new documents are available for transfer to his dead drop points. The murders are not separate acts of violence. They are additional tasks performed during operational runs. One journey underground, multiple objectives. Collect the documents, deposit them at the dead drop, and eliminate any threat that has emerged since the last operation. It is efficient. It is disciplined. And it is the methodology of a man trained in military intelligence, where economy of exposure is a fundamental operational principle. "The boot prints," I said. Holmes nodded and moved to the plaster casts. He had arranged them in a row, 3 sets of prints, one from each murder site. Even to my untrained eye, the similarity was obvious. The same heavy-soled military tread, the same size, the same distinctive pattern. But Holmes drew my attention to a specific detail. The left heel in every cast. The wear pattern on the left heel is asymmetric, heavier on the outer edge, with a slight drag mark trailing behind the print. This is not the mark of a defective boot. It is the mark of a man compensating for an old injury to his left leg. The injury is not severe enough to produce a visible limp under normal conditions. Our man walks evenly enough in public to attract no attention, but under exertion, in the uneven terrain of a tunnel floor, the compensatory pattern reasserts itself. He cannot help it. His body remembers the wound even when his mind has learned to disguise it. He straightened. I have obtained, through various pretexts over the past week, the boot impressions of every suspect in this case. Edgar Mallory's boots show perfectly even wear on both heels, no asymmetry whatsoever. Reginald Marsh wears civilian shoes with rubber soles, entirely inconsistent with the prints. Eric Brenner favours continental-style boots with a smooth sole and narrow heel, again a complete mismatch. Only one man among our persons of interest has yet to provide a boot impression, because only one man occupies a position of sufficient authority that requesting his boots would require a degree of justification I have not yet been prepared to reveal. "Vane," I said. "Colonel Vane served in the Afghan campaign. He was wounded in action, a detail of public record, cited in his commendation for gallantry. The nature of the wound is described in the military medical records as a rifle ball to the left thigh, resulting in temporary loss of mobility and a prolonged recovery. The wound healed. The limp officially resolved. But a rifle ball through the thigh leaves damage to muscle and bone that no amount of recovery fully erases. Under exertion, walking quickly through an uneven tunnel, for instance, the old injury would produce precisely the asymmetric gait pattern recorded in every plaster cast on this table." Holmes moved to the bullets. He held up the 2 rounds recovered from Keegan and Bell, turning them slowly in the lamplight. Both bullets are military specification revolver rounds, consistent with a Webley Fosbury fitted with a suppressor attachment. Both entered the victims from a slightly leftward angle, not dramatically so, but consistently so. A right-handed shooter firing at close range produces a trajectory that is either straight or slightly rightward, depending on stance. A left-handed shooter produces a leftward bias. Colonel Vane is left-handed. He raised his wine glass with his left hand. He gestured with his left hand. He reached for the bread with his left hand. Every unguarded movement at dinner confirmed a dominant left hand, and every bullet in this case entered from the left. He set the bullets down and reached for the dispatch schedules. Now consider the alibi. On each of the 3 critical nights, November the 20th, November the 25th, and December the 5th, Colonel Vane signed the guest book at the Reform Club between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening. On each night, there followed a period of approximately 90 minutes, during which no member of staff interacted with him. Vane claims he was reading in the library. The club librarian has no recollection of seeing him in the library on any of those evenings, and the guest book records his departure between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, meaning the 90-minute gap falls precisely within the window required to descend into the tunnel system, conduct an operation, and return to the club in time to sign out. He paused. And what did Vane tell us, over dinner at his own club, in his own words? He told us that a man can traverse half of London in 90 minutes if he knows the shortcuts. He told us this casually, as an observation, a piece of trivia shared over pheasant and claret. But it was not trivia, Watson. It was a precise operational estimate, drawn from personal experience, delivered with the confidence of a man who has made the journey many times and no longer thinks of the duration as remarkable. Holmes stood in silence for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back, surveying the assembled evidence with the expression of a man who has completed a difficult equation and is checking his work one final time. The missing tunnel survey was requisitioned under War Office authority, and Vane is the War Office's principal advisor on underground infrastructure. The courier cylinders are military design, and Vane has extensive field experience with military logistics. The weapon is a suppressed military pistol available only through restricted armories, and Vane holds a security clearance that would grant him access to precisely such weapons. The operation follows War Office dispatch schedules, and Vane occupies a position that gives him advanced knowledge of every classified dispatch. The boot prints show a left-legged injury pattern, and Vane carries an Afghan war wound to his left thigh. The bullets show a left-handed trajectory, and Vane is left-handed. He turned to me. Every piece of physical evidence points to a killer who is military-trained, left-handed, left-leg injured, possessed of War Office authority, and intimately familiar with the tunnel network. Every piece of circumstantial evidence points to a man who was present at the Reform Club on every murder night with an unverifiable 90-minute absence, and every piece of behavioural evidence points to a man who has been cooperative, charming, and helpful, who has offered his assistance freely and provided information generously, because a man who appears to aid an investigation is the last man anyone suspects of being its subject. Holmes sat down at last. The morning light was strengthening through the windows, and the fire had burned low in the grate. He looked tired, genuinely tired in a way I seldom saw. But beneath the fatigue there was a resolution that had the quality of iron. I have been wrong about many things in this case, Watson. I was too slow to protect Keegan. I did not anticipate Bell's murder. I allowed Vane's performance of cooperation to delay my suspicions by days that cost a man his life. These are failures I do not intend to repeat. He reached for the cold coffee on the table and drank it without complaint. Edgar Mallory is innocent. His boots do not match. His hands do not match. His background does not match. He is a man destroyed by debt and grief, not a killer. And Lestrade's case against him, however compelling it appears on paper, collapses the moment it is tested against the physical evidence. I intend to demonstrate this to Lestrade today, and I intend to do so in terms that leave no room for argument. And then? Holmes set down the cup and met my eyes. And then, Watson, we set a trap. Colonel Vane has been operating beneath London for 18 months without detection. He has killed 3 men. He has sold his country's secrets to a foreign power. And he has done all of this while dining at his club, attending War Office briefings, and shaking hands with the very men whose trust he has betrayed. He believes he is untouchable, and as long as we pursue the investigation openly, he will continue to believe it. The moment we make our suspicion known, he will vanish into the tunnels, out of the country, beyond our reach. He leaned forward. We must give him a reason to enter the tunnels one more time. A reason so compelling that he cannot resist, and so urgent that he cannot delegate. We must bring the phantom out of the dark, Watson, and we must be waiting for him when he arrives. Chapter 9. The Trap on the Northern Line. Holmes presented his case against Edgar Mallory's innocence, or rather, his case for it, in Lestrade's cramped office at Scotland Yard on a Tuesday morning that was cold enough to freeze the Thames and grey enough to make one wish it would. Lestrade listened with the expression of a man being asked to abandon a building he has spent weeks constructing, brick by painstaking brick, and who can already hear the foundations cracking beneath him. Holmes was thorough, he was methodical, and he was, in his particular way, merciless. "The boots," he began. "You're placing the plaster cast on Lestrade's desk like exhibits at a trial. 3 murder sites, 3 identical sets of prints, heavy military tread, asymmetric wear on the left heel consistent with a chronic injury to the left leg. I obtained Edgar Mallory's boots through a pretext, a request for elimination purposes, which he provided willingly. His boots are civilian manufacture, rubber-soled, and show perfectly symmetrical wear on both heels. Edgar Mallory walks with an even stride. He has no injury to either leg. He did not make these prints." Lestrade opened his mouth. Holmes continued without pause. "The weapon. Thomas Keegan and Arthur Bell were killed with a suppressed military pistol, a Webley Fosbury automatic fitted with a suppressor attachment that is issued exclusively through restricted military armories. Edgar Mallory has no military background. He has never served. He has never held a firearms certificate. He has no known connection to any military institution, armory, or personnel. The suggestion that he obtained a weapon of this specificity through civilian channels is not merely unlikely, it is functionally impossible. Holmes, the garrote. Edward Mallory was strangled with a military-grade wire garrote, a weapon that requires not only the instrument itself, but the training to employ it. The ligature marks show a single, continuous application of pressure with no hesitation and no repositioning. This technique is taught in military intelligence training. Edgar Mallory is a man who has spent his adult life accumulating debt and consuming alcohol. He has not been trained in covert killing. He does not possess the physical discipline or the technical knowledge to execute a garrote strangulation of the kind that killed his brother. Holmes placed his hands flat on the desk. The tunnel network. Our killer navigates a system of abandoned Victorian passages with absolute confidence. Passages that are unmapped, unsealed only through deliberate effort, and accessible only to someone who has studied the original 1867 engineering surveys. Edgar Mallory is a financial consultant's brother who lives in rented rooms in Mornington Crescent. He has no engineering knowledge, no familiarity with underground infrastructure, and no means of obtaining the survey documents that were removed from the Public Records Office under War Office authority 18 months ago. He straightened. The unfinished letter in Edward Mallory's pocket was addressed to the War Office. It reads, "I have discovered an irregularity of the most serious nature concerning..." You have assumed, Lestrade, that this letter relates to the inheritance dispute between the brothers. It does not. Edward Mallory handled sensitive War Office financial accounts. The irregularity he discovered was not domestic, it was institutional. He was reporting an espionage operation, and he was killed before the letter could be completed. The inheritance dispute is a coincidence of timing, nothing more, and it has led this investigation down a path that the real killer could not have designed more effectively if he had planned it himself. Lestrade sat in silence for a long moment. His moustache twitched. His pen, which he had been holding throughout Holmes's presentation, had not touched paper once. "Then who?" he said at last. "I am not yet prepared to name him," Holmes replied. "Not because I lack conviction, but because conviction without proof is accusation. An accusation without proof against a man of the suspect's standing would be professionally catastrophic for you and legally futile for us. What I require is one more night. Give me one more night, Lestrade, and I will give you the killer, not as a theory, but as a man caught in the act, with the evidence in his hands and no possibility of denial." Lestrade studied Holmes with the particular wariness of a man who had been led by Sherlock Holmes into dark places before and emerged with results he could not have achieved alone but had not entirely enjoyed achieving. One night, Lestrade said, and if it goes wrong, then Edgar Mallory remains your suspect, and I shall trouble you no further. Holmes paused, but it will not go wrong. The plan was set in motion that afternoon. Holmes met with Mycroft in the Diogenes Club, that peculiar institution where silence was the only enforced rule and conversation was confined to the stranger's room. I was not present for the meeting, but Holmes described its substance to me afterward with the precision of a man reciting operational orders, which is essentially what they were. Through Mycroft's channels, the precise nature of which Holmes did not specify, and I did not ask, a rumour was to be introduced into the War Office, a highly sensitive government dispatch containing intelligence of exceptional strategic value. It would be transferred through the underground tunnel system that night. The transfer would use the Northern Line passages. The documents would be placed at the primary dead drop point near Mornington Crescent at midnight. The rumour must reach Vane through channels he trusts, Holmes explained. It must appear to originate from the normal flow of War Office intelligence, not planted, not suspicious, not unusual. It must be the kind of information that Vane, in his position, would naturally receive in the course of his duties, and it must be sufficiently valuable that he cannot afford to delegate its collection. He must come himself. How can you be certain he will? I asked. Because the rumour specifies a dispatch of the highest classification, material that, if captured, would represent the most significant intelligence coup of Vane's entire operation. He has spent 18 months building this network. He has killed 3 men to protect it. He will not trust a prize of this magnitude to anyone else. His discipline will compel him to collect it personally, and his arrogance will assure him that the tunnels remain safe. And if he suspects a trap, Holmes considered this, he may. Vane is not a fool, but he has been operating without detection for 18 months, and success breeds confidence. He has watched the investigation chase Edgar Mallory, chase the Phantom Legend, chase every false trail he has laid, and he has concluded, reasonably, that no one is looking in his direction. The rumour will reach him through trusted channels. The dispatch schedule will align with established patterns. Everything will look normal, because the most effective trap, Watson, is one that looks exactly like the thing it is imitating. That evening Holmes made his preparations. He obtained from Lestrade a small team of plainclothes officers, 4 men, selected for their discretion and their ability to remain silent and motionless in darkness for extended periods. He requisitioned lamps with shuttered screens that could be opened or closed in an instant. He studied Arthur Bell's tunnel maps and Irene Calder's annotated diagram until he had committed every passage, junction and access point to memory, and then he did something I had not anticipated. The secondary exits, he said, spreading the tunnel map on our table. There are 3 points at which the hidden passage network connects to the active Northern Line tunnels. Vane will enter through one and, if threatened, attempt to flee through the others. These exits must be sealed before midnight, physically sealed, so that no amount of strength or ingenuity can force them open. Bricked up? Precisely. I have arranged for a crew from the railway works to close the 2 secondary exits this afternoon, under the pretext of routine maintenance. By nightfall, the only way in or out of the hidden tunnel network near Mornington Crescent will be the primary access point, the concealed doorway we discovered on our first expedition, and that is where we will be waiting. I looked at the map. The primary access point opened into a junction where 3 passages converged, a natural bottleneck impossible to bypass. Holmes had chosen his ground with the instinct of a military tactician, and I said so. I have learned from our opponent, Holmes replied, without irony. We descended into the tunnels at 10 o'clock. The station had been closed under the pretense of an engineering inspection, Lestrade's authority, backed by Mycroft's invisible influence, ensuring that no questions were asked that could not be answered with a vague reference to safety protocols. Holmes led the way through the service passage, past the site where Edward Mallory had died 6 weeks earlier, through the concealed doorway in the false wall, and into the Victorian corridor beyond. The air was cold and utterly still. Our shuttered lamps threw narrow beams that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness rather than penetrating it. The silence was immense. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a buried place, like where sound itself seemed to have been interred along with the passageways. Holmes positioned us with care. Lestrade and 2 officers were stationed in an alcove 30 feet from the primary access point, concealed behind a curve in the passage wall. The remaining 2 officers were placed at the junction itself, pressed into the deep shadows of the converging corridors. Holmes and I took our position in a narrow recess directly opposite the concealed doorway, close enough to see and hear anyone who entered, far enough to remain invisible in the absolute darkness. And then we waited. Time in a tunnel does not behave as it does on the surface. Minutes stretch. The darkness presses against the eyes with a physical weight. Every sound, the distant groan of settling earth, the faint drip of water through ancient brickwork, of the almost subliminal vibration of trains running through adjacent tunnels, becomes amplified by the silence surrounding it. I stood with my revolver in my hand and my back against the cold wall, and felt the tunnel close around us like a held breath. Holmes stood motionless beside me. I could not see his face in the dark, but I could feel his stillness, the absolute, predatory stillness of a man who has set his trap and is waiting for the mechanism to engage. He did not shift. He did not whisper. He was as much a part of the darkness as the stone itself. At 7 minutes before midnight, I heard it, a sound so faint that at first I could not distinguish it from the background murmur of the tunnel, a rhythmic disturbance in the silence, barely perceptible, growing slowly more distinct. Footsteps, measured, confident, unhurried. And beneath the rhythm, a secondary pattern, a subtle asymmetry, a fractional hesitation on every other step, as though one foot carried a burden the other did not, a left-legged limp, concealed by discipline, betrayed by darkness and uneven ground. A light appeared in the distance, faint, yellowish, steady, an oil lantern, the old railway kind. It moved toward us through the passage with the unhurried pace of a man walking a familiar road, and as it drew closer, the light resolved the darkness into shapes, the curve of the tunnel walls, the rough texture of Victorian brickwork, and the tall figure carrying the lantern, a man in a long dark overcoat and wide-brimmed hat, moving through the buried passages of London with the confidence of someone who had made this journey 100 times before. The Phantom of the Northern Line. He reached the junction and paused. The lantern light fell across the concealed doorway, across the loose bricks of the false wall, across the alcove where the brass courier cylinders were deposited. He set the lantern on the ground, knelt, and reached behind the loose brick with a practised hand. His fingers found what Holmes had placed there hours earlier, a sealed cylinder, identical to the ones used in every previous exchange, containing documents that bore every appearance of genuine War Office dispatches. He unscrewed the cap and examined the contents. Satisfied, he replaced the cap and slipped the cylinder into the pocket of his greatcoat. Then he reached into an inner pocket and withdrew a second object, a pistol, compact and fitted with the cylindrical extension of a suppressor. He held it loosely, professionally, and in his left hand. Holmes opened the shutter of his lamp. The light hit the Phantom like a physical blow. He spun, the pistol rising, and for a single frozen instant the tunnel was a tableau. 6 men emerging from the darkness, lamps blazing, and at the centre of it all the tall figure in the greatcoat, his face now illuminated, sharp-featured, blue-eyed, no longer smiling. "The passage behind you has been sealed, Colonel," Holmes said. His voice was calm and carried the full length of the tunnel without effort. "As have the exits at the north and south junctions. There is nowhere to go." Vane did not move. The pistol remained raised, pointed at the darkness between Holmes and Lestrade. His breathing was controlled. His hand was steady. He was calculating. I could see it in his eyes. The rapid assessment of a military mind evaluating options and finding, for the first time in 18 months, none. I raised my revolver. "I would not, Colonel," I said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then something shifted behind Vane's eyes. Not surrender, not fear, but the cold recognition of a position that could not be held. He lowered the pistol. He set it on the ground. He straightened, and even in defeat, his bearing retained the rigid composure of a man who had been trained never to show weakness, even at the end. Holmes stepped forward and pulled back the collar of the greatcoat. The lantern light fell full upon the face of Colonel Marcus Vane. "The Phantom of the Northern Line," Holmes said, "a decorated soldier, a trusted adviser, and a traitor to the crown." Chapter 10. The Phantom Revealed. The interrogation room at Scotland Yard was a bare, cheerless chamber. Whitewashed walls, a single high window admitting a grudging stripe of December light, and a heavy oak table scarred by decades of confessions, denials, and the nervous fingernails of men whose futures had narrowed to the dimensions of that room. Colonel Marcus Vane sat on one side of the table with the erect posture of a man attending a briefing rather than facing the dissolution of everything he had built. Holmes sat opposite. Lestrade stood by the door. Mycroft Holmes occupied a chair in the corner, his considerable bulk arranged with the deceptive stillness of a man who appeared to be dozing, but was, in fact, absorbing every syllable with the precision of a recording instrument. I stood against the wall with my notebook and watched a mask come apart. The evidence was laid before Vane piece by piece, and Holmes presented it with the dispassionate thoroughness of a surgeon exposing the anatomy of a disease. The brass cylinder recovered from Vane's coat pocket contained 3 documents: a classified assessment of naval deployments in the North Sea, a summary of diplomatic negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, and a memorandum on the restructuring of military intelligence operations in East Africa. All 3 bore the markings of War Office originals. All 3 had been reported missing from the classified registry within the preceding week. The suppressed pistol, recovered from Vane's left hand at the moment of capture, was a Webley Fosbury automatic fitted with a custom suppressor of military manufacture. Ballistic comparison confirmed that the rounds it fired were identical in caliber, weight, and rifling pattern to the bullets extracted from the bodies of Thomas Keegan and Arthur Bell. The weapon's serial number had been filed away, but the suppressor bore an armory stamp that Holmes had already traced to a restricted military stores facility in Woolwich, a facility to which Colonel Vane held authorised access. The boots Vane wore in the tunnel were heavy-soled military issue, and the left heel displayed the asymmetric wear pattern that Holmes had catalogued at every murder site. The plaster casts matched exactly, not approximately, not suggestively, but with the absolute precision of a key fitting its lock. The worn heel corresponded to the documented rifle wound Vane had sustained in Afghanistan, and the gait pattern it produced under exertion was identical to the stride recorded in the dust of 3 separate tunnels where 3 separate men had been killed. Vane listened to all of this with an expression that betrayed nothing, neither surprise nor concern nor the faintest trace of the charm he had deployed so effectively at the Reform Club. When Holmes finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Vane spoke. "You are thorough, Mr. Holmes." I expected no less. "I was not thorough enough," Holmes replied. "If I had been, Thomas Keegan and Arthur Bell would still be alive." Something flickered behind Vane's eyes. Not remorse exactly, but a kind of professional acknowledgement, as one strategist, recognizing the regret of another. You could not have prevented Keegan. The decision was made before you entered the case. Bell was regrettable. He was closer to the truth than I realized, and I acted on incomplete intelligence. It is the occupational hazard of any operation conducted under pressure. You speak of murder as though it were a logistical inconvenience, I said. Vane turned his gaze to me. I speak of it as what it was, Dr. Watson, a necessity. I did not enjoy killing those men. I did not seek it out. Each death was a response to a specific threat, a security measure implemented when all other options had been exhausted. Mallory discovered the tunnel operation and was preparing to report it. Keegan saw me entering the passages and could identify my physical description. Bell was mapping the tunnel activity and would have eventually traced the routes to their source. In each case, the alternative to elimination was exposure. An exposure would have destroyed not merely my operation, but the network of contacts and intelligence channels that took years to establish. You describe a treason of 18 months' duration, Mycroft said from his corner. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of a man who spoke rarely and was listened to absolutely when he did. The documents you have compromised include strategic assessments, diplomatic correspondence, and military operational plans. The damage to national security is extensive. The damage to national security, Vane repeated, and for the first time something surfaced in his voice that was not calculation. A bitterness, hard and deep, that had been buried beneath the performance of the loyal officer for longer than the espionage itself. You speak to me of national security, Mycroft, from your chair at the Diogenes Club, where you move pieces across a board and never see the blood. I served this country for 22 years. I carried its secrets through Afghan passes where the temperature could kill a man before the bullets did. I took a rifle ball through the leg at Maiwand and lay in the dirt for 6 hours before anyone came. And when I returned to London, decorated, commended, praised in dispatches, I found that the Crown's gratitude extended to a modest pension and an advisory position that paid less than a senior clerk's salary. He leaned forward. I did not begin this operation out of ideology, gentlemen. I began it out of debt. The kind of debt that a man accumulates when his service to his country has left him with a ruined leg, a modest income, and the expectation that he will continue to maintain the appearance of an officer and a gentleman on means that would embarrass a shopkeeper. The Prussians approached me. They were generous, they were professional, and they asked for nothing more than what the War Office was already producing in abundance: paper, reports, assessments, memoranda. The currency of bureaucracy, flowing endlessly through Whitehall, most of it read by no one and acted upon by fewer. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself for quite some time. And the murders, Holmes asked, were those harmless as well? Vane met Holmes's gaze without flinching. The murders were the consequence of an operation that had ceased to be controllable. Mallory stumbled onto the tunnel network through his financial audits. He noticed discrepancies in the transport accounts that led him to the sealed passages. I arranged a meeting under the pretense of helping him understand what he had found. I intended to assess whether he could be bought or frightened into silence. Within 5 minutes of conversation, I knew he could not. He was a man of principle, Mr. Holmes. It is the principled men who are the most dangerous. And so you strangled him with a garrote you carried for the purpose. I carried it as a precaution. I am a military intelligence officer. Or I was. One prepares for contingencies. The garrote was quick. Mallory did not suffer. I take no satisfaction in that. But I do not apologize for efficiency. Keegan? Keegan saw me entering the tunnel on the night I killed Mallory. My costume, the coat, the lantern, was designed to create confusion, to ensure that any witness would describe a ghost rather than a man. It worked for a time. But Keegan was persistent. He spoke to the police. He spoke to you. when I learned through Marsh that Keegan's testimony was being taken seriously, that you, Mr. Holmes, had visited him and were treating his account as evidence rather than folklore, I could not afford the risk. The suppressed pistol, timed to the passage of a train, clean, inaudible, regrettable. And Arthur Bell? Bell was the most dangerous of the three because he was the most methodical. A retired engineer who knew the tunnel system from his years of service and had taken it upon himself to monitor underground activity as a private project. His notebook, which I assume you have recovered, contained observations that, given enough time, would have mapped my entire route network. He contacted you, Mr. Holmes. That was his death warrant. I could not allow a man with his knowledge to provide you with the infrastructure diagram you lacked. The room was silent. Vane's account had been delivered with the clinical precision of an after-action report. No emotion, no justification beyond operational logic, no appeal for sympathy. It was, in its way, more chilling than any passionate confession could have been. This was a man who had weighed 3 human lives against the security of his operation, and found the arithmetic straightforward. Holmes spoke at last. The phantom disguise, the coat, the lantern, the theatrical appearances timed to passing trains. Explain the reasoning. Vane's expression shifted, the faintest ghost of what might have been professional pride. Fear is more effective than any lock or cipher, Mr. Holmes. I needed the tunnels to remain uninvestigated. Police barriers and official closures would have drawn precisely the kind of attention I wished to avoid. But a ghost story, a genuine, self-propagating legend of a phantom haunting the Northern Line, that was camouflage of the highest order. People do not investigate what they are afraid of. They avoid it. They whisper about it in pubs. They write colourful articles in newspapers. And they leave the tunnels to the phantom, which is to say, to me. You weaponized superstition. I weaponized human nature. The coat was purchased from a theatrical costumier in Drury Lane, an authentic 1850s railway inspector's greatcoat, the kind of garment that looks precisely like what people expect a ghost to wear. The lantern was genuine, an old oil lamp from the original Northern Line construction, found in one of the sealed passages during my initial survey. The timing was deliberate. I appeared only during the passage of trains, when noise and vibration created confusion, and I disappeared through the maintenance doors before the train cleared. To any observer, I materialized from nowhere and vanished into solid wall. The effect was reliable. Holmes stood. He looked down at Vane with an expression I'd rarely seen on his face. Not anger, not contempt, but something colder and more final. A judgment rendered not in passion, but in full understanding. Colonel Vane, you understood that the greatest protection a criminal can possess is not secrecy alone, but misdirection. You gave London a phantom to chase, a ghost story to whisper about in pubs and parlours, so that no one would think to look for the man in uniform walking calmly through their midst. You murdered 3 men, not out of passion or vengeance, but with the same operational discipline you once applied in service of the Crown. The tunnels were your theatre, the phantom your mask, and fear your most reliable accomplice. He turned to Lestrade. The case is yours. Inspector. The aftermath unfolded with the grim efficiency that attends matters of state security when the state wishes them to be resolved quickly and quietly. Vane was tried in a closed military tribunal. No public gallery, no press, no record accessible to civilian courts. The proceedings lasted 3 days. He was found guilty of treason, espionage, and 3 counts of murder, and was sentenced to imprisonment for the remainder of his natural life. He received the verdict with the same composure with which he had received everything else, and was removed to a facility whose name and location were not shared with Holmes, with me, or with anyone outside the narrow circle of officials who manage such things. Eric Brenner was expelled from the country through diplomatic channels within a week of Vane's arrest. The Prussian embassy issued a formal denial of any involvement in intelligence operations on British soil, a denial that Mycroft described in one of his rare moments of dry humour as admirably consistent with Prussian diplomatic tradition. Reginald Marsh cooperated fully with the investigation and provided detailed testimony about the access arrangements he had maintained for Vane over 18 months. In exchange for his cooperation, he received a reduced sentence of 2 years and the permanent loss of his railway pension, a punishment that Holmes considered lenient, but Lestrade considered proportionate to the man's role as a frightened accomplice rather than a willing conspirator. Edgar Mallory was formally cleared of all suspicion. He inherited his brother's estate, as the will had always intended, and used a portion of it to settle the debts that had driven him to such desperate straits. I saw him once more, several months later, at a memorial service for Edward. He was thinner, quieter, and carried himself with the fragile dignity of a man who had been broken and was attempting, with uncertain success, to reassemble the pieces. He thanked Holmes for proving his innocence. Holmes accepted the thanks with a brevity that I recognised as discomfort. The case had cost 3 lives, and Holmes did not consider the saving of one man's reputation adequate compensation. Irene Calder's partial evidence proved invaluable in mapping the full extent of the tunnel network, which was subsequently sealed by government engineers under Mycroft's supervision. Her knowledge of Edward's secretive activities, gathered not out of malice but out of the sharp-eyed pragmatism of a woman determined to protect her own interests, had provided Holmes with tunnel locations at a critical stage of the investigation. She asked for nothing in return and received nothing, which appeared to suit her. Watson later wrote, and I write now, setting down these words in the quiet of my study with the winter dark pressing against the windows, that although the phantom was unmasked, the story of the ghost on the Northern Line persisted in London legend for decades afterward. Workmen on the late shift still spoke of a tall figure, glimpsed at the edge of lamplight. Passengers on the last trains still reported the faint glow of a lantern in tunnels where no lantern should be. The phantom Colonel Vane had invented outlived the man himself, a testament to the enduring power of the fear he had so skillfully weaponized, and a reminder that some stories, once set loose in the dark, refused to be recaptured by the light. Holmes's final words on the matter were delivered in our sitting room on the evening the tribunal concluded, spoken to the fire rather than to me, in a tone that carried neither triumph nor satisfaction, but something closer to the weary clarity of a man who has looked too long into a particular darkness and understood what he found there. Convinced London it sees a phantom, and no one will look for the man behind the mask. He set down his pipe and did not speak of the case again.